Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the Texas problem that's been simmering right off to the side of our narrative for more or less the last couple lessons. We haven't dealt with the whole Texas issue yet because it's a really complicated story and it sort of interweaves with Mexican history. And so I'm going to take a brief interlude today to give you a short overview of Mexican history, the history of the settlement of Texas, and why Texas was such a thorny issue for the United States going forward. So let's dive in. Here's our basic objectives for today. Take a minute and pause and take them in. And I'm going to dive in. Some of this is going to be recap from world history. Some of this might be new to you guys. And so I'm, again, going to give the briefest overview of this conflict to hopefully allow you to understand why the issue of Texan independence was pretty thorny for the United States during this time period, regardless of the issues involving slavery. So one thing that's relatively important is the cotton boom has been a thing that's been happening throughout more or less this entire unit. With the introduction of the cotton gin and the growth of industrialization, we see a huge spread in cotton across the southern states. The problem, of course, with this is eventually we run out of territory to continue to expand cotton. And so as Southerners continue to move west, looking for new areas to expand into cotton, they run into this new territory called Mexico, which originally was part of New Spain, but then eventually became its own independent country. And so the cotton boom is going to lead to increasing pressure to expand to the southwest in order to secure more land to grow this incredibly lucrative cash crop that is fueling both the southern economy, but also the Industrial Revolution in the northern economy, and is a valuable export crop to Europe at the same time. And so cotton was extraordinarily valuable, and therefore finding new land that would eventually be used for cotton cultivation was absolutely essential. So to go to Mexican history, the northern Spanish colony of New Spain was not the most economically developed part of the Spanish Empire. We'll give you a second to pause and read this. There were obviously lots of groups who felt locked out of both political and economic power, and so all of these things came together, as they did in most of Latin America during the Napoleonic Wars, leading to a push for Mexican independence. There was this fear of the white Criollo and Peninsulare population, that the massive group of Native Americans and mixed race people would push back and would eventually seize power unless there was some revolution or some movement to give them some of their demands. And, contrary to Spanish society in the Caribbean, there was still a relatively large population of Native Americans who were sort of already living on the margins of Mexican society, all of whom could be drawn upon for a potential independence movement against Spain, as long as they're promised that this whole situation will eventually be remediated, will be improved, etc. So there was a push and a desire for Mexican independence, a significant amount of potential energy that could be turned into the kinetic energy of revolution. This revolution broke into the open with the whole Grito de Dolores, the call of Dolores, Father Miguel Hidalgo here, leading groups of mostly mixed race and Native Americans into rebellion. His army was able to defeat the Spanish army at a number of different battles, but Hidalgo failed to capitalize on these victories. As you hopefully remember from your world history classes, he was somewhat worried about being able to continue to control this massive sort of popular army he'd created. And so rather than marching on the capital of Mexico City, he sort of marched around southwest Mexico until his army melted away. He was eventually captured and killed. But his mantle was picked up by Jose Morelos, who then continued the fight until he was eventually captured and killed by the Spanish general Agustin Iturbide, but Vicente Guerrero then picked up the fight and continued a guerrilla war. Mexican independence, like Spanish-American independence, is a long, sort of drawn-out process, with the Spanish winning a series of victories, and there were a bunch of setbacks for the revolutionaries, until eventually, of course, the mutiny at Cadiz brought the whole thing to a close. As you hopefully remember from your world history classes, the Spanish monarchs, after Napoleon was exiled, so the abdication of the Spanish monarchs was the kickoff, with the spark for this revolution. And when the Spanish monarchs were restored, once Napoleon was kicked out of Spain, they attempted to raise an army to go put down all of these rebellions in the Americas. That army, unfortunately, instead of marching to their ships and sailing to the Americas, once they found out where they were going, this army in Cadiz mutinied, marched on the capital of Madrid and forced Fernando to accept a constitution. And this was basically the last time that Spain would try to send an army to the Americas. So, with no help coming, the royalists and the rebels joined together to form, in Mexican history at least, the Army of the Three Guarantees, unifying themselves among religious and cultural lines. And there was a union between Agustin Iturbide and Vicente Guerrero here. This army would then march into Mexico City and establish a new independent Mexico. Unfortunately for Mexican history, the Mexican government was spectacularly unstable. As soon as peace was declared, Iturbide took over and declared himself the quote-unquote emperor of Mexico. But he was forced from power by his political enemies, and this would become a pattern in early Mexican history, with military strongmen seizing power, other dissidents building armies from their specific regions of control, marching on the central government, overthrowing it, replacing it, only to then be overthrown in turn. In the first 20 years of Mexican history, the head of state changed hands 20 different times. And it wasn't all the same group of people. You can see Santa Anna overthrowing the government repeatedly, only to be overthrown himself. These 11 guys here are going to make up the first 50 presidents of Mexico. And as you can see, sometimes serving only for a year in power before eventually being overthrown. This prevented Mexico from developing any real centralized authority. It prevented them from economically developing their country or developing any stable political traditions. And so the history of Mexico is going to be a history of instability and the inability of the government to effectively establish a mandate and to govern. As we see here, at the same time, Mexico was trying to hang on to the territories at their fringes. So take a minute and read Stephen F. Austin's account of this. So this is the Mexicans, in order to try to hold on to their northern territories, specifically the northern state of Tejas, they invited American settlement by bringing in the Austin family, Moses Austin and his son Stephen F. They allowed them to come into Mexican territory and settle, with the understanding that they would then help hold on to this territory against hostile Native American groups and help the Mexican government establish some control over these regions. The Native Americans really had more or less ignored Spanish authority here. They were worried about another Pueblo-style revolt and a breakaway Native American state. And so by bringing in the Austin family, the hope was these Americans would bring money, they would bring investment, and they would solidify Mexican control over the northern state of Tejas. Unfortunately, most of the settlement, rather than going off and fighting Native Americans sort of in the deserty parts of northern Texas, the Austin family mostly settled in sort of the fertile coastal and river valley region of eastern Texas and began planting cotton and importing enslaved people. They didn't generally learn the language. They didn't learn Spanish. They didn't really recognize or acknowledge the authority of the Mexican government, despite the fact that they had invited them in there. And so after about 20 years, the Mexican government started to get pretty wary about these American expats who had moved onto their territory and seemed more as if they were maybe colonizing it for the United States than solidifying Mexican control over it. And so when Vicente Guerrero, the former revolutionary, ascended to the top job temporarily, he is going to end slavery and attempt to stop American immigration, making it illegal for Americans to move in and making it illegal for them to move their enslaved people in. This, of course, was totally ignored by the Americans, who continued to emigrate across the border, continued to bring in enslaved people, and totally ignored the authority of the Mexican government. And so when Guerrero is overthrown by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is going to seize control of the government. He's going to pretend as if he was fighting for the liberty of the Mexican people, overthrow and suspend the Mexican Constitution. And this is going to lead to revolts all across Mexico. Many Mexicans were extremely upset with this, as we can see Don Lorenzo de Zavala here. So take a moment and read and describe the situation in Mexico. And keep in mind that the Texas Rebellion was one of a bunch of different rebellions against the rule of Santa Anna. And honestly, it was one of the least important ones for him. Texas is a hinterland out on the sort of the very fringes of Mexican territory. Santa Anna went to put down all these other revolts first, long before he went to deal with the Texas rebels. And then finally, so here's your Texas Declaration of Independence. So take a moment and read it. And keep in mind that, again, all of these Mexican states are doing exactly the same thing. And so Santa Anna goes and marches and puts down all of these other revolts and then finally marches to deal with the Texas rebels. I'm going to massively oversimplify the Texas Revolution. The most famous battle of the Texas Revolution is the Alamo, where thousands of Mexican troops attack a mission in the Alamo next to what is modern-day San Antonio. And they defeat the American defenders, despite the fact that they defeat the very outnumbered American defenders. And the Texas rebels were substantially outnumbered and fought almost to the last man, providing a rallying cry for the Texas rebels of "Remember the Alamo." Feeling overconfident, Santa Anna then spread his troops out across the territory, attempting to find the Texas rebels. And extremely unfortunately for him, the band that he was with was trapped by a guy named San Houston in the Battle of San Jacinto, and Santa Anna himself was captured. As a captive, he was then forced to sign a document recognizing Texan independence, and Texas created their own constitution, modeled after the U.S. Constitution, which had term limits, legalized slavery, things like that. They modeled their flag just slightly after the American flag. You can sort of see some similarities there, hopefully. But Santa Anna, his capture led to his immediate overthrow in Mexico City, and the new Mexican government had zero interest in recognizing the independence of Texas. And so Mexico refused to recognize this rebellious state. They still claimed all of the territory of the northern state of Tejas. And there was even some question as far as, even if they were to recognize it, where the border between these two territories would be. Because the Texas rebels are claiming a land all the way to the Rio Grande, which they absolutely do not control. And so this leads to a massive controversy. And even within Texas itself, there was some opposition here. People who were of Spanish blood and Spanish heritage did not support the Texas rebels and felt that they had very little reason to revolt. And so you've got this maybe not independent state of Texas sitting on the border. And then before Mexico can deal with any of this, they get invaded by France. Over the course of one of the rebellions, a French bakery gets burned to the ground. And so France sends a punitive expedition right about the time that Texas has won its independence. They occupy control over the port of Veracruz and steal money from the Mexican treasury in order to pay for their destroyed bake shop. And the very weakened Mexican government now does not have the power to go and suppress the rebellion in Texas. And so a combination of luck and foreign events allow the Texas rebels to be successful. Mexico is a substantially weakened country, but again, there's this huge battle over annexation. Especially as the anti-slavery movement grows, Northerners oppose annexation of Texas because it would bring in new areas that would be open to slavery, and anti-war advocates also oppose the annexation of Texas. The whole process to annex Texas is a whole comedy of errors anyway. The first ship that was sent down to negotiate with the Mexicans had this massive gun called the Peacemaker on board. And when it was test fired as an attempt to sort of psych us up for our negotiations, it blew up, killing the current Secretary of State and further delaying any sort of negotiations. And so you've got all of these things delaying the issue. And so Texas is just going to sort of sit there, right on the border of the United States, maybe a rebellious province, maybe a part of Mexico, maybe an independent territory. And clearly, if we annex Texas, it will mean war with Mexico. And so although there was significant support for the annexation of Texas, there was significant opposition to it as well. And the Texas problem is going to be a key problem moving forward. So that brings us to our conclusion here. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. And when we come back, we'll talk about westward expansion across the northern part of the United States. Thank you for listening.